I paid the bills, but my mom gave my room to her friend and kids. What happened next shocked her. Hello, read it? Family was always the foundation of everything I thought I stood for. My mom made sure of that when I was growing up. Family is everything, Jack. She'd say anytime I questioned why I had to give up something for someone else. It was her mantra, repeated so often it became the backdrop of my life. I didn't just hear it, I absorbed it. When my dad walked out on us when I was 16, the words became gospel. I had to step up. There wasn't another choice. I'm Jack, 28 years old, and I've spent over a decade keeping our household afloat. I started working part-time when I was 16, bagging groceries and stacking shelves to help pay for food, utilities, and all the little things that my mom's paycheck from a retail job couldn't cover. At first, I thought it was temporary. I thought it was just what older kids did to help out when times were tough. By the time I graduated, I wasn't just helping out anymore, I was paying most of the bills. Rent, utilities, even the car insurance that kept our beat-up sedan on the road. I had dreams of going to trade school to become a welder, but those dreams got put on hold. My mom needed me. My younger sister, Emma, was still in high school, and someone had to step in to make sure everything stayed afloat. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was what family did for each other. I told myself it would be worth it in the end. But as the years passed, the sacrifices piled up. Trade school turned into working odd jobs, scraping together enough money to keep the lights on while my mom worked part-time and my sister focused on school. Even when I finally got certified as a welder at 23, the financial strain didn't ease up. Instead of saving for my own future, I poured every extra penny into keeping our family's small, worn-down house from falling apart. I thought my efforts would be appreciated. I thought my sacrifices meant something. I was wrong. It started 3 weeks ago, on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday. I had just finished a long, grueling day at the shop, 10 hours of welding in the heat, my back aching, my hands covered in grime. All I wanted was to go home, take a shower, and collapse in a bed. My bed, my room, the one place in the world that felt like mine. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something unusual. 2 kids' bikes were lying in the front yard, their neon frames tipped over in the patchy grass. For a second, I thought Emma might have friends over, but the bikes were too small to belong to teenagers. I brushed it off, assuming my mom was babysitting for someone. But as soon as I opened the front door, I knew something wasn't right. The house was loud. Not the kind of loud I was used to, the sound of Emma's music blasting or the TV on full volume. This was different. Kids were screaming and laughing somewhere down the hallway, and I could hear furniture being dragged across the floor. I dropped my tool bag by the door, my stomach tightening as I called out, "What's going on?" No one answered. The closer I got to my room, the louder the chaos became. When I turned the corner and saw my door wide open, my chest tightened. Inside, 2 kids I didn't recognize were jumping on my bed, their laughter echoing off the walls. My bed, my sanctuary after a hard day's work, was covered in crayon marks and smeared with what looked like juice stains. The desk I used to use for paying bills and organizing my projects was gone, replaced with a cheap folding table covered in coloring books and broken crayons. My clothes had been shoved into boxes and piled against the wall, like garbage waiting to be thrown out. And the smell, sticky juice, stale snacks, and the faint sourness of something old and unwashed. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like I was standing outside my own life, looking in at someone else's disaster. This wasn't my room anymore. This wasn't my home. My mom appeared in the doorway, holding a laundry basket and looking completely unfazed by the chaos. "Oh, good, you're home," she said, brushing past me as if nothing was out of the ordinary. She set the basket down and started gathering clothes off the bed, my bed, while I stood there, frozen in disbelief. "What's going on?" I finally managed to ask, my voice tight. She sighed, as though I were being difficult. "Sophie needed a place to stay," she said, as if that explained everything. Sophie. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Sophie was my mom's friend from work, a woman I'd only met a handful of times, but had heard plenty about. She was the type of person who seemed to bounce from one bad situation to the next, always dragging drama behind her. Apparently, her latest crisis had landed her and her 2 kids in our house. In my room, I asked, the words catching in my throat. "Don't be dramatic," my mom replied, brushing off my question like it didn't matter. "You've got the couch. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. I felt a surge of anger, so intense it left me lightheaded. For years, I had sacrificed everything to keep this family going. My time, my money, my dreams, and now, without so much as a warning, I was being pushed aside like I didn't matter. But what hurt more than the invasion of my space was the message behind it. My mom didn't value me. She didn't see me as a person with needs or boundaries. To her, I was just a resource, a tool she could use and discard whenever it suited her. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't yell, didn't demand answers. I didn't have the energy. Instead, I grabbed a box of my belongings, retreated to the couch, and tried to process what had just happened. But sleep didn't come. The sounds of Sophie's kids running up and down the hallway, the quiet murmur of my mom chatting with her friend, the smell of juice and crackers wafting through the air. It was all too much. By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying. By the time the first rays of sunlight seeped through the living room curtains, my decision was made. I wasn't staying. Not in this house, not in this dynamic, and certainly not in a place where I was treated like an afterthought. It wasn't just about the room, though that had been the breaking point. It was about years of being taken for granted, of sacrificing for a family that seemed to think my contributions were invisible. This wasn't the first time I'd been pushed aside, but it was the first time I realized I didn't have to take it. The morning passed in a haze as I packed my things. It was strange, standing in a house I had helped support for over a decade, knowing I was about to walk away from it all. I kept telling myself it was the right choice, that I deserved better, but every so often, doubt crept in. Was I being selfish? Was I abandoning them? The questions lingered, but I pushed them aside. My mom hadn't thought twice about handing over my space to Sophie and her kids. She hadn't considered how I might feel, how it might affect me. If she wasn't worried about me, why should I be worried about her? As I worked, I couldn't help but notice the chaos unfolding around me. Sophie's kids were running through the house, screaming and laughing, leaving a trail of crumbs and juice spills in their wake. Sophie herself was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while my mom made coffee and chatted with her like they were old friends catching up. None of them acknowledged me. Not a single word was said as I moved my belongings out of the boxes they had shoved into the corner of my room and into my old duffel bag. It was as if I were a ghost, already erased from the family picture. By mid-afternoon, I was ready to go. I had packed the essentials, clothes, tools, my laptop, a few sentimental items, and left the rest. I didn't have a solid plan, but I figured I'd crash with a friend for a few days while I figured things out. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying here. As I carried my bags to the front door, my mom finally looked up. For a moment, I thought she might say something, apologize, explain, anything. But instead, she just frowned and asked, "Where are you going?" Her tone wasn't concerned. It was accusatory, as if I were the one causing problems. "I'm leaving," I said simply. Her frown deepened. "Don't be ridiculous, Jack. Where else would you go?" I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the door and stepped outside, letting the screen door slam shut behind me. It wasn't until I was on the road, driving away from the house I had called home for so many years, that the weight of what I was doing hit me. For years, I had told myself that my sacrifices were worth it, that my family needed me, that staying was the right thing to do. Now, for the first time, I was putting myself first, and it was terrifying. I ended up crashing in my friend Mike's place. He didn't ask too many questions, just handed me a beer and said, "Stay as long as you need to." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. On one hand, I was free. Free from the guilt, the expectations, the constant drain of being the family's fixer. On the other hand, I had no idea what came next. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts to save for my own place. The long hours were exhausting, but they kept my mind off the situation at home. But home wasn't done with me yet. It started with the phone calls. At first, my mom called once or twice a day, leaving voicemails that ranged from confused to outright angry. "Where are you? You can't just leave like this, she'd say, as if I had abandoned my post without permission. I ignored the calls. Then came the texts. Short, clipped messages demanding that I come back and fix the mess I had caused. When those didn't work, she switched tactics, sending longer messages filled with guilt-tripping phrases about how I was hurting the family and abandoning my responsibilities. The messages only fueled my resolve. I hadn't abandoned my responsibilities. I had walked away from a situation that had become unbearable. I had every right to leave, to put myself first for once. But the turning point came a week later, when my mom showed up at Mike's apartment. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted and covered in sweat, when I saw her car parked out front. She was sitting on the hood, arms crossed, her expression a mix of frustration and desperation. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stepping out of my truck. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked me up and down, as if trying to gauge how far she could push me. "We need to talk," she said finally. I leaned against the side of my truck, crossing my arms. "About what?" "About you coming home," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is ridiculous, Jack. You can't just leave us like that. Sophie's going through a hard time, and we're trying to help her. You walking out isn't helping anyone." I stared at her, my exhaustion giving way to a sharp, simmering anger. "I'm not coming back," I said. Her face fell. "Jack, be reasonable. This isn't just about you. It's about the family. We all make sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "I've spent years making sacrifices, Mom. Paying bills, covering rent, giving up everything so this family could stay afloat. And how did you repay me? By moving someone else into my room and acting like I didn't matter. That's not family, and I'm done pretending it is." Her expression shifted, her frustration giving way to something softer. Sadness, maybe, or guilt. But she didn't apologize. She just sighed and said, "I didn't think you'd take it so personally." That was the moment I knew she didn't understand. She couldn't. I didn't say anything else. I just walked past her and into the apartment, leaving her standing there near the hood of her car. After my mom drove away from Mike's apartment, I thought I could finally breathe again. I believed that by standing my ground and refusing to return home, I had made my position clear. The weight I had carried for years, of always being the dependable one, the fixer, felt lighter in those first moments of solitude. For the first time, I had said no, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like I was finally free. The silence that followed was almost eerie. My phone, which had been vibrating incessantly with calls and messages, suddenly stopped. No voicemails, no guilt-laden texts. The absence of noise felt strange, like standing on a cliff's edge and waiting for the wind to knock you over. At first, I thought it was acceptance. Then my mom had realized I wasn't going to fold this time. But deep down, I knew it was something else. My family had a way of turning calm into a weapon. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. The illusion of peace broke 3 days later. Emma, my younger sister, called me out of the blue. She wasn't the type to get involved in family disputes. Her natural state was quiet neutrality, avoiding conflict whenever possible. That's why her voice, tight with unease, immediately put me on edge. She had called to warn me, her words cautious and careful about the things being said back home. According to Emma, Sophie was no longer just a guest in the house. She had become something else entirely, a force shaping the narrative in my absence. Sophie had been whispering in my mom's ear, suggesting that my departure was a sign of selfishness, that I had left because I didn't want to share, that my contributions to the household hadn't been as significant as I believed. Hearing those words secondhand hit me harder than I expected. They didn't just sting, they tore into old wounds, reopening every moment I had doubted myself over the years. For so long, I had poured my time, energy, and money into that house, sacrificing my own dreams to keep it afloat. And now, in my absence, my efforts were being dismissed as if they meant nothing. The word selfish clung to me like a shadow, circling in my mind no matter how much I tried to shake it off. I wanted to believe Emma when she said she didn't agree with Sophie's claims, but her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. The poison had already spread, and my mom was listening. For the next week, I buried myself in work. The shop became my escape, the noise and heat of welding drowning out the thoughts that clawed at the edges of my mind. I worked longer shifts than ever before, my body aching by the time I got home to Mike's apartment each night. The exhaustion helped, numbing the anger and frustration that simmered just beneath the surface. But no matter how busy I stayed, I couldn't outrun the pull of my family's dysfunction. Another call from Emma came a few days later, her voice more frantic this time. Something had happened at the house. Sophie's kids, who had already proven themselves to be chaotic whirlwinds of destruction, had broken something expensive, a television, from what Emma could gather. Instead of addressing the issue directly, Sophie had turned it into yet another indictment of my absence. If I had stayed, she argued, the house wouldn't have descended into chaos. My mom, predictably, latched onto the idea. It didn't matter that I wasn't there when it happened. In their eyes, my leaving had caused the problem, and my return was the solution. The frustration and disbelief that followed were almost too much to process. I had left because I was tired of being treated like a resource, tired of having my needs dismissed, and here they were proving me right. Even from a distance, I was still the scapegoat, the one blamed for problems I didn't create. I agreed to visit the house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I needed to see for myself what had become of the place I had worked so hard to hold together. The drive back felt surreal. The house loomed ahead like a ghost of my past, its familiar exterior untouched by the chaos within. The lawn was overgrown, the porch light flickered, and the same peeling paint from years ago remained. But stepping inside was like entering a different world entirely. The first thing I noticed was the noise. Sophie's kids were tearing through the living room, their shouts and laughter bouncing off the walls. Toys and crumbs littered the floor, juice stains darkened the carpet, and the faint smell of neglect hung in the air. Sophie was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her posture radiating indifference. My mom was in the kitchen, her movements hurried and tense as she prepared food. The exhaustion on her face was palpable, but what struck me most was the resentment in her expression. It wasn't directed at Sophie or her kids. It was directed at me, as though my leaving had somehow caused all of this. Emma hovered nearby, her presence quiet but anxious. She looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. The television, now broken and dark, sat in the corner like a symbol of everything wrong with the situation. My absence had become the scapegoat for their mess. My refusal to stay cast as the reason their fragile balance had collapsed. Standing there, surrounded by the chaos, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't my home anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Leaving the house for the second time felt different. The first time, I had left in anger, my decision driven by the need to escape. This time, I left with a sense of finality. I wasn't just walking away from the house or the family dynamics that had drained me for years. I was walking towards something better. The weight of responsibility that had clung to me for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to build a life that was mine. Leaving the house for the second time should have felt final, but the threads of my past still clung to me like cobwebs. I had stepped away from the chaos, made it clear that I wasn't coming back, but my family's hold on me wasn't something that could be severed so easily. Even as I focused on building a new path for myself, they found ways to drag me back into the mess I had tried to escape. The first few days after my visit were a haze of relief and frustration. I had faced the chaos head-on, seen for myself the state of the house and the toxic dynamic that had taken root there. But instead of closure, I was left with a lingering bitterness, a sense of injustice that refused to fade. At Mike's apartment, I tried to lose myself in the mundane tasks of daily life, cooking simple meals, organizing the few belongings I had brought with me, and scrolling through apartment listings in the evenings. The thought of finding my own place brought a mix of excitement and anxiety. It was the first step toward a life I could truly call mine, but it also felt like uncharted territory. For so long, my identity had been tied to my role in that house, to the sacrifices I made and the expectations I fulfilled. Now I was redefining what it meant to be me. But my family wasn't ready to let me go. The phone call started again, first from my mom, then from Emma. The messages were different this time, less accusatory, more pleading. My mom's voice, once sharp with frustration, now carried a thread of desperation. She spoke about how hard things had been since I left, how the house felt emptier without me, how Sophie and her kids were more difficult to manage than she had anticipated. She didn't apologize or acknowledge the pain her actions had caused, but the underlying message was clear. She wanted me back. Emma's messages were softer, filled with concern. She told me about the mounting tension in the house, how my mom and Sophie were arguing more often, how the kids were becoming harder to control. She hinted that Sophie's presence was wearing on everyone, even my mom, but she stopped short of saying what I already suspected. My mom had made a mistake. The guilt started creeping back in, a familiar weight pressing against my chest. For years, I had been the one to hold things together, to smooth over conflicts and fix what was broken. Now, from a distance, it felt like I was watching everything unravel. Part of me wanted to step in, to pick up the pieces like I always had. But another part of me, the part that was learning to value my own needs, held firm. I reminded myself of why I had left, of the years of sacrifice that had gone unnoticed, of the way my mom had dismissed my feelings as if they didn't matter. I thought about Sophie's smug indifference, the way she had taken over my space without a second thought. No matter how much I wanted to help, I couldn't go back to being that person, the one who gave and gave until there was nothing left. Still, the tension gnawed at me, even as I worked longer hours and saved every penny for my own place. The pull of my family's dysfunction lingered in the background. It was like a weight I couldn't fully shake, a reminder of the ties that bound me to a house I no longer called home. Weeks passed, and the cracks in my family's new arrangement began to widen. Emma's updates became more frequent, each one painting a clearer picture of the chaos unfolding at the house. Sophie's kids were growing restless, their energy unchecked as they tore through the space without regard for boundaries. My mom, overwhelmed by the added strain, had started snapping at Sophie, leading to heated arguments that echoed through the walls. The house I had worked so hard to keep afloat was falling apart, and this time, I wasn't there to fix it. One evening, Emma called me again, her voice trembling with frustration and exhaustion. She described how Sophie had overstepped yet again, treating the house as if it were hers to control, dismissing my mom's rules and expectations. The tension had reached a boiling point, and Emma admitted that she didn't know how much longer things could go on like this. I listened, my jaw tightening as the familiar urge to intervene rose within me. But I didn't act on it. Instead, I reminded myself that this wasn't my battle to fight anymore. My mom had made her choice, and now she was living with the consequences. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel the first glimmers of freedom. I was saving more money than I ever had before, finally able to put myself first without the constant drain of supporting a household that took me for granted. I found a small studio apartment across town, modest but clean, and began to envision a future that wasn't defined by someone else's needs. But just as I was starting to move forward, my mom showed up at Mike's apartment again. This time, she looked different. The frustration and anger that had marked her previous visit were gone, replaced by something quieter, almost resigned. Her posture was slumped, her face lined with exhaustion. She didn't say much at first, just stood on the doorstep as if waiting for permission to speak. When she finally did, her words carried a weight I hadn't expected. She spoke about how hard things had been since I left, how the house felt emptier without me. She admitted, in her own roundabout way, that Sophie's presence had been more disruptive than she anticipated, that the balance she thought she could maintain had crumbled under the weight of her decisions. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest she had ever come. As I listened, a mix of emotions swirled within me: anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of vindication. For years, I had carried the burden of keeping that house together, and now, in my absence, my mom was finally starting to see the cracks. But even as she spoke, I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't return to a dynamic that had drained me for so long, no matter how much she pleaded or how sorry she seemed. Standing on the threshold of Mike's apartment, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the the moment where I could finally let go of the guilt and move forward. My mom's visit to Mike's apartment marked a turning point, but not in the way she had intended. Seeing her standing there, worn down by the choices she had made, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. There was a part of me that wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, just as I had done so many times before. But then I remembered all the years I had spent sacrificing for a family that seemed to take my efforts for granted. I thought about the nights I had spent worrying about bills while my mom spent money on things we didn't need. I thought about the moment I came home to find my room given away without warning, my belongings shoved aside like they didn't matter. And I thought about the quiet freedom I had begun to feel since I left, the growing sense that I was finally living for myself instead of for someone else's expectations. As my mom spoke, her words carrying a mix of regret and desperation, I realized that her visit wasn't about reconciliation. It was about trying to pull me back into the role I had finally escaped. She talked about how hard things had been without me, how much she missed having me at home, how Sophie and her kids had overstayed their welcome. She hinted at needing my help to restore balance, but she never directly said the words I was waiting to hear. I'm sorry. She didn't apologize for what had happened. She didn't acknowledge how her decisions had hurt me, how her actions had made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. Instead, she focused on how my absence had affected her, framing the conversation in a way that left no room for my feelings or boundaries. It was the same dynamic I had always known, her needs taking precedence over mine, her view of the situation eclipsing my reality. When she left that evening, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had listened to her, given her the opportunity to explain herself, but I hadn't let her guilt me into coming back. For the first time, I had stood firm, refusing to let her rewrite the narrative. In the weeks that followed, I poured my energy into creating a new life for myself. Moving into my studio apartment was a milestone that felt both exhilarating and surreal. The space was small and unassuming, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every dish in the cupboard, every framed photo on the wall was a reflection of my choices, my independence. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Life didn't change overnight. There were still moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether I had done the right thing by leaving. But as the days turned into weeks, those moments grew fewer and farther between. I started to see the possibilities that lay ahead, the freedom to pursue my own goals, to focus on my own happiness without the constant pull of family obligations. Occasionally, I heard updates from Emma. She told me that Sophie had finally moved out, though not without drama. The tension between Sophie and my mom had reached a breaking point, culminating in an explosive argument that left both sides bitter and resentful. Sophie's departure left the house in disarray, a physical reminder of the chaos she had brought with her. Emma admitted that things hadn't returned to normal, even after Sophie was gone. My mom was still struggling to manage the house on her own, and the financial strain was beginning to take its toll. She had started picking up extra shifts at work, something she hadn't done in years. Hearing those updates was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt vindicated. My absence had forced my mom to confront the consequences of her actions, to take responsibility for the choices she had made. On the other hand, there was a lingering sadness, a recognition that our relationship might never fully recover from what had happened. Months passed, and the distance between me and my family began to feel less like a wound and more like a boundary I had set to protect myself. I didn't cut ties completely. I still answered Emma's calls and occasionally sent my mom a text to check in. But I kept my distance, ensuring that I wouldn't be pulled back into the dynamics that had drained me for so long. One quiet afternoon, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipping coffee and watching the city skyline, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having everything figured out or from knowing that life would be smooth sailing from here on out. It was the peace of knowing I had taken control of my own story. For so long, I had let my family's needs define me, shaping every decision I made and every step I took. Now, for the first time, I was writing my own narrative, free from the expectations and guilt that had weighed me down. My mom never fully apologized for what happened. She never acknowledged the depth of her betrayal or the pain she had caused by treating me as if I didn't matter. But I had stopped waiting for an apology, realizing that my closure didn't have to come from her. It came from within, from the steps I had taken to reclaim my independence and rebuild my sense of self-worth. Life didn't become perfect after I left, but it became mine. I pursued projects I had put off for years, reconnected with old friends, and even started exploring the idea of going back to school. As for my family, they adjusted in their own way. My mom eventually managed to stabilize the household, though Emma admitted that it wasn't the same without me there. She tried to convince me to visit more often, but I kept my boundaries firm, knowing that going back too soon would only risk undoing the progress I had made. In the end, I learned that leaving wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about choosing myself. It was about recognizing that I deserved more than to be an afterthought in my own life. And as I stood in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the life I was building, I realized that I hadn't just left a house. I had left behind the version of myself that believed my worth was tied to what I could give to others. I had finally found freedom,